I completed the CFA Charter in 2023 for ChatGPT and all the AI tools you have today. Back then, it was just me, mountains of information, and endless late nights trying to make sense of it all. If AI had been around during my CFA journey, I can tell you it would have been a whole lot easier. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to leverage AI to supercharge your CFA studies, save hundreds of hours, and give yourself the edge needed to smash the exams. So let's go. If you're new here, I'm Harris, an investment banker and CFA charter holder who studied at Imperial College London. Okay, let's discuss how you can use AI and ChatGPT specifically to supercharge your learning. Now, this is a super powerful tool that you can use in a variety of ways, and there's a few use cases that you can see on screen, and I'm going to step through them one by one. But before I begin, I just want to call something important out, which is that learning is still about friction. It must still be effortful, because only then are you actually engaged in deep learning, and deep learning is necessary if you're going to do well in the CFA Charter. So you shouldn't use it to bypass all friction in your studies. Remember, it's a tool to enable learning, not a substitute for learning. However, if you use it correctly, it can be super useful across both the understanding, retention, and application phase. So as I said, there's a few use cases that we'll step through, and I'll show you some worked examples. So that includes explaining complex topics, explaining calculations, helping with formula memorization, testing yourself, and that's a Feynman technique, and we'll use the voice feature, which is super cool, and finally flashcard creation. So let's start with using ChatGPT to explain complex topics, and the example I'll use is the IS and LM curve in economics. Now, I've put up the curve on screen, and if you face this in economics, you'll know it's absolutely horrible. It's super conceptual, and it can be quite difficult to understand how it applies in the real world. So we'll look at how you can use targeted prompts to help you understand this curve. So I've already loaded up the conversation so you don't have to watch ChatGPT produce the answer, but at the top you can see my prompt, which is actually very specific. So I've said, in economics, I'm struggling with the IS and LM curve. I have no idea of the relevance, importance, and use case of it. In simple terms, can you explain it to me? Now, as I said, I've been very specific. I don't know the relevance, importance, and use case, and I've asked it to produce an answer in simple terms, rather than simply asking it what the IS and LM curve is, because it's going to throw a bunch of information at me. So let's have a look at how it's responded. So it started by explaining what the IS and LM curve actually is. So it's a macroeconomic tool used to explain how interest rates and GDP interact in the economy. And it's comprised of two curves. So you've got the IS curve, which is the investment savings curve, and that represents the goods market. And then you have the LM curve, which is the liquidity money curve, and that represents the money market. So then it goes on to break down the IS curve first, which is the goods market, and essentially breaks down the components and the slope and what drives movements in the curve. So specifically, government spending increases shifted to the right because it means a higher GDP, and also higher taxes shifted to the left. Similarly, it does the same thing for the LM curve, again highlighting the components and the various shifts in the curve, and then it covers how the two curves interact. Now brings it to life with an example of government stimulus. So if the government increases spending, the IS curve shifts to the right and GDP rises, so interest rates rise. On the flip side, central banks respond by printing money, so the LM curve shifts to the right and interest rates drop back down. So it's highlighting how monetary and fiscal policies interact. Then it gives us a few examples of the relevance in the real world, and then it asks me, would I like a real world case study to make it even clearer? And I said, yes, please provide a simple real world example. And then it breaks down exactly what happened during the financial crisis, and I'm not going to step through all the components of this, but this is an example of how you can interact with ChatGPT and ask it to become more and more specific or add more and more layers so that you can reinforce your understanding. I also think this is great because sometimes you're not happy with the example or the explanation provided in the curriculum or by the lecturers, depending on which prep provider you use. So this can give you an alternative way to look at the concept. So skimming to the bottom, it gave a nice little summary for us, and that brings it all together. Okay, let's look at the second use case, which is using ChatGPT to explain calculations. So we'll look at an example, which is cross-currency calculations in economics. And if you face this, you'll know it's absolutely horrible. Currency is one of the most difficult things to understand, unfortunately, but ChatGPT can help simplify it. Now we'll come back to this example that you can see on screen, but first I'm going to ask ChatGPT to explain the concept to me. So again, we start with the prompt, and again, I've been specific here. So I've said I'm struggling with cross-rate calculations within currency exchange, economics, CFA level 1. Please explain how we approach these and include neat ways of remembering which currency is in the numerator and denominator. Now that's one thing that people tend to struggle to keep straight, so I've asked it for some techniques to help me remember that. So it starts by outlining what a cross rate is. So it's an exchange rate between two currencies that is calculated using their exchange rates with a third currency. So in simple terms, if you have two currency pairs, you can use them to calculate a third currency pair. So the example here is we have USD GBP and Euro USD, and then we can use these two to calculate Euro GBP. So then it goes on to provide the general formula, And then as we step through it, it gives us a worked example, which is very useful. And then as we go even further down, it provides us memory tricks for the numerator and denominator, which was the specific part that I was struggling with. And usefully, it's provided two methods and you can choose which one you vibe with the most. Then it provides a shortcut formula or a quick rule of thumb, and finally a recap, which is all very useful. And then we go on to ask it to apply this to a specific example. So just to remind you, I've taken this snip from the curriculum. So here we're looking at calculating a 37-day forward rate for JPY, or the Japanese yen, and Canadian dollar. We've got the interest rates for the two currencies and the spot rate, and then we'll go ahead and calculate the forward rate. Now, if you look at the answer, you might not be happy with this because it's just a bunch of numbers. So if you want additional layers of explanation, you can then paste this into ChatGPT. It can scan it and then break it down and provide a full explanation. So as you can see, I've pasted it in here and asked it to analyze and explain the answer to the following question. So it's correctly identified that this question involves interest rate parity and the calculation of forward exchange rates. And it goes on to break down how you would actually calculate this. So the first step is understanding the data that we're given. So it just outlines exactly what that is and the formula used. And then we go through the process of applying the formula, and then we keep progressing down to interpreting the answer. Now, one of the things here for me when I first read it was, why is the Japanese yen expected to appreciate relative to the Canadian dollar over the 37-day period? So there's a few key takeaways here, which is useful to know, and then a final summary. And the inverse of what we just said is, if the Japanese yen is expected to appreciate against the Canadian dollar, the Canadian dollar is thus expected to depreciate or weaken against the Japanese yen. Now the question is, why is that? So I can follow up and ask a question. So I've done that, and now it breaks down the core idea of interest rate parity. So the idea here is that exchange rates adjust so there is no risk-free arbitrage opportunities between two currencies. So it breaks down the formula and interest rate differential, and then fully breaks down why a higher rate currency is actually expected to depreciate. And if we skip ahead to what this means in plain terms, you can see higher interest rates in a country lead to expectations of depreciation because investors anticipate the higher returns in Canadian dollar are offset by a weakening currency. It then gives me a practical example to reinforce the idea. And finally, it summarizes all the key points. And I think this is super helpful because, as I said, you don't always get this level of explanation in the curriculum, and you can't interact with it in the same way and ask follow-up questions. So it's like having a tutor in your pocket. Now, one thing I would call out is it is possible for ChatGPT and AI in general to hallucinate. So if you're reading the answer and it doesn't quite seem right, just follow up and ask it to double check, and often it can self-correct if there is an error in there. Real quick, if you're interested in passing the CFA and building a career in finance, I have something special for you. It's a short video where I break down the exact process I used to pass all 3 CFA exams first time and land my dream 6-figure job in investment banking, and how I help others do the same. In fact, we guarantee results. Pass your CFA exams first time and land a $100,000 plus role in finance, or we'll help you for free until you do. Plus, if you're watching this before the 14th of July, I'll send you my free CFA Formulas Masterclass, where I break down how to master formulas without rote memorization. So hit the first link in the description and see if it's for you. Okay, the next use case is using ChatGPT to help memorize formulas. And the example we'll use is the dividend discount model, or DDM, in equity. Now, I have included a snip from ChatGPT on this slide. So you can see there's a mnemonic for remembering the DDM formulas, and the acronym is DRG, or Dr. G, as we'll see in a second. And essentially you can see the 3 variations of DDM on screen, but let's look at how ChatGPT breaks this down and helps us memorize. So as you can see, this time my prompt is, can you give me a way of memorizing the DDM formulas in equity? And it goes on to say, okay, cool, I'll give you a structured way to remember them using a memory trick, intuitive understanding, and pattern recognition. So it starts by outlining what the core formula is, and then outlines what the 3 versions are. So we have zero growth, and here it's essentially like an annuity or a preferred stock. Then you have constant growth, and finally multi-stage. So it breaks down a few memory tricks. So as I said, the first one is using the Dr. G method, where D is dividend, R is required return, and G is growth rate. And it breaks it down quite nicely for us to help inform our logic, and then looks at some pattern recognition to help recall formulas quickly. And I like this one. All formulas start with dividend or D. If there is growth, then you include G and you subtract it from R in the denominator. And then if multiple growth phases exist, break it into parts, i.e. the high growth phase and then the constant growth phase. And then we have an alternative mnemonic as well. And finally, it brings it together with some CFA exam tips, which is again super useful. Real quick, the CFA exams are highly time pressured, so if you're going to pass them, you need to master the calculator. But most people don't know where to start, so I created a free guide with everything you need. The link is in the description. Okay, the next use case we're going to look at is using ChatGPT to test your understanding and essentially use the Feynman technique. And to do this, we're going to use the voice feature within ChatGPT, which is super cool. And if you open up a new chat, you'll see this icon in the bottom right, which looks a bit like a microphone or a sound wave, and that is how you can access the voice feature. So we'll look at a worked example, and we're going to be discussing duration in fixed income. Right, I'd like to discuss bonds with you, and I'll start by outlining my understanding of bonds, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Go for it.
So my understanding of bonds is that they are a form of IOU with an agreed repayment amount at a future date, that is the maturity date, and in the interim there will be an agreed coupon, which is the interest rate, and that can be fixed or floating, and that interest rate or coupon will be paid annually, semi-annually or quarterly, and that will affect the compounding. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Bonds indeed function as IOUs, with those key details affecting the overall returns.
Okay, so that's good. Thank you for franking my understanding. What I'm a little bit hazy on is what duration is. So can you start by explaining what both Macaulay and modified duration are?
Sure. Macaulay duration is the weighted average time until a bond's cash flows are received, measuring in years. Modified duration, on the other hand, estimates how much a bond's price will change with a 1% change in interest rates, serving as a measure of interest rate sensitivity.
How do I switch between Macaulay and modified duration?
To switch between Macaulay and modified duration, you use the bond's yield. Modified duration is calculated by dividing the Macaulay duration by 1 plus the yield per period. This adjustment accounts for the compounding effect of interest rates.
Okay, thank you for your help. So as you can see, it's super cool. It's a feature I would have used if it was available to me whilst I was studying the CFA, but I have since played with it, and I'm very impressed with its capabilities. So if you get a bit fed up of simply having to write out your understanding, you can then take to the voice feature and explain your understanding, and then ask ChatGPT to ask you some follow-up questions, which is again a great way to further reinforce your understanding.